That's great. Good evening, everyone. Hi. Welcome to Andromeda 7 Celestial Gateway. We are your open window of opportunity, I like to call it, for communication, sharing, knowledge, love, and community support and help. So welcome to our show tonight. This is our, 8th installment of Esoteric Egypt.
Already.
And we are very pleased and very grateful to have with us tonight Laird Scranton. Welcome, Laird. Lots of you folks might be aware and know who Laird is, and some of you may not, but we thank Audrey Roden for the introduction, along with Annie XT, Khadijah, Scotty Roberts, and a host of others that know and respect Laird. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laird.
And for the folks that are listening in,
well, thank you. I'm having response time issues here.
A little delayed response. Yeah, that's okay.
It's okay.
That's all right. We're used to that. We got people from all over the world coming in, so there's bound to be a little bit of that. For our listening audience, we have. Yeah, I'm sorry. What? Still a little slow there, Laird?
Yeah.
We'll see.
What I might try doing is signing out and signing back in from a different PC and see if we can get a better response.
Okay, sure.
Yep, sounds good.
In the meantime, I'll just...
if that works for you.
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
You bet.
No problem.
Yeah,
so while he's doing that, let me just let you know who's on the panel tonight. Crystal MacArthur, our show host from Friday night shows, has joined us tonight for this because she's ramped up about the Dogon folk. We have our Australian team with us. Jules up there, Aussie Bird Jules, our alchemist. Mandy Moo, our crystal alchemist. Look at them picking on each other already. You can't trust these two. We got Dalibor Suchi from Germany, a native of Czechoslovakia, is with us, and our operator and co-host Lori Cross from Pure Love Ascension. Lori keeps everything running smoothly and works on all the graphics for the show and drives the bus. She drives the bus. And in our audience tonight, hello everyone, we have Rainbow Phoenix. Hey Paula, nice to see you tonight.
Paula.
And Doug Stack, how you doing? He says we can start the show. He's hit the like button. He doesn't even know if he liked the topic yet. That's a true blue patriot.
Yes, it is.
Gazakov from New Zealand and residing in Australia as well.
Can we just clear something up? I'm pretty sure it's Gaza. He's
Gaza.
Aussie. It's
Gaza.
Yes.
Thank you, honey. Gaza. Audrey. Hey, beautiful Audrey, our sister. Lovely sister Audrey. Kelly. Lori's sister Kelly Cross is in there.
Hi, Kel.
Kelly Preston Cross. Is that right?
That's right.
Do I have that right? Kelly Preston Cross.
So regal.
So I don't know if I've missed it. Oh, we have Giant here. How you doing?
Hi, Giant.
A
Giant. Lee Ryder.
Glad to see you, Lee Ryder. Yes. So that's it for now, and others will be rolling in as we start, and others are listening. So welcome to our listening audience.
Welcome, everybody.
We hope to have Laird coming back in on another computer in just a moment. Before we went live on YouTube, he was pretty clear, didn't have much lag, but when he came into the stream with other people, it started to act up on him a little bit. Yeah, which happens. Hey, Brother Barry Chad. Well, anyway, let me give you a brief background on Laird, and hopefully he'll be able to get back in while we're doing this. There he is.
Yeah.
There's Laird.
Hi, Laird.
Hopefully that's better.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
Yay. Well, we just said hi to everybody, and including our friends from New Zealand and Australia out there in the audience, and Audrey Roden's out there for you, Laird.
Oh, good. I actually have a sister in Auckland, New Zealand, but I don't think she's listening in tonight.
Oh, is she from New Zealand? Yeah. Well, just send her the link later and tell her to listen in. Yeah. Let me give you a little bit of background on Laird Scranton, everybody. Like I said, most folks are going to know who Laird is. He graduated from Vassar College in 1975, and Laird is the author of a series of books and other writings on ancient cosmology and language. These include articles published in the University of Chicago's Anthropology, New Academic Journal, Temple University's Encyclopedia of African Religion, the Encyclopedia Britannica. He's also featured in some of John Anthony West's programs like What's His Magical Egypt documentary series and Carmen Bolter's documentary, The Pyramid Code, if everybody remembers that one. That was a really good one. He's a frequent guest on a wide range of radio and podcast interview shows, including Red Ice Radio in Europe. I think I remember you from Art Bell's Desert Midnight.
Right.
Coast to Coast Radio. Gaia, or did they say Gaia?
Gaia.
Gaia TV,
Gaia
Beyond Belief with George Norrie. He's also a frequent presenter at conferences who focus on ancient knowledge, including Walter Crutenden's conference on precession in ancient knowledge.
Right.
I missed that. ARE's Ancient Mysteries Conference. You were at Scotty Roberts' Paradigm Symposium.
Right.
And you were with the Fringe New Jersey Conference, James Swagger's Megalithic Odyssey Symposium in Marlborough, England.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've written a number of books, I guess going all the way back to 2003, if I recall.
Right.
And
I self-published my first book in 2002, and then it was republished in 2005 by Inner Traditions.
That was Science of the Dogon?
Originally, it was called Hidden Meanings, and it got republished as The Science of the Dogon.
Oh, okay, right. And now that's the one I have. And then there's the Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol.
Right.
The Velikovsky Heresies. I didn't read that one. China's Cosmological Prehistory. That was a good one. Point of Origin is one of the better books out there, in my opinion. It really, if you're just getting into this research, it really gives you a good focus. Seeking the Primordial, Decoding Mori? The Mori Cosmology? And is that how they pronounce it?
Right.
Maria.
In Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah, so that's the one Mandy should snatch a copy of. That's probably a good one. I haven't read that one. Ganesha, the Scientific Symbolism of a Hindu God.
Right.
Prismal Wisdom of the Ancients.
Primal Right.
And Tracing Orkney's Origins, which you've just recently wrapped up, last year?
Right. I think October or so I published that.
Right. And now you're featured also in a couple of other books called Forbidden Science in 2008 and Lost Secrets of the Gods. I seem to remember reading excerpts from Lost Secrets of the Gods.
Mm-hmm.
I know you helped co-author Ed Nightingale's book, The Giza Template.
Right.
That was back in 2014.
Right. That's
so
90% his work. Well, my wife, Risa, and I just sort of helped him tighten it up and sort of polish up what he was trying to say.
Yeah, well, that was another good reference book. All of these are excellent references, and we have provided your links in our YouTube description page. They'll go on our website when we get back in contact with the web developer to upload your information into the system so that you'll be part of our information portal. But all of your links to all of your that you provided me to your archives and your books. I think you go through. Do you go through a publishing house or do you go through Amazon? I can't remember.
My publisher is Inner Traditions. They're a subsidiary of Simon and Schuster, and so the bulk of my books are through them. But I was saying before we started talking that it takes them about 18 months to produce a book from the time the manuscript's submitted to the time it sees print.
Yeah.
And during that time, I have time to finish a second book and self-publish it. So the last 3 years, that's what I've done. So there are right now three of the volumes are self-published through Kindle Direct Publishing, and the rest of them are through Inner Traditions.
Okay. All right. Well, we certainly have a powerhouse of information at our fingertips this evening. So, once again, we're honored to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
Before the group launches into this discussion, thought it might be helpful, and you've seen the pictures, to give our viewers who are watching this sort of a brief feel for the Dogon people, where they're from, where they live, how they currently live, some of their art, and you'll start seeing some things in there that might trigger some things for some of you, and you can see why there's such a great deal of interest. They are pretty much have isolated themselves for centuries from the outside world in terms of knowing and keeping and hanging on to their beliefs. So, Lori, why don't we just bring up the PowerPoint presentation? We'll take you through some of these pictures, folks, to give you a feel of who we're dealing with here. And Laird can weigh in on these. Where the opening screen here is showing their rock wall art. Does it look familiar, Mandy? Compare it to some of the rock wall art you have in Australia. And these are just some photos of some of Laird's. I'm going to order Scarab Bray. That's going to be a connection with Egypt and
Scotland. Yes, that is very interesting.
So that's one that I'm waiting to have delivered any minute. Next slide. Now this is a couple maps of Africa, y'all, and the Dogon people live in the northeastern side of Africa, across from, not east, west. So if you go west across from Egypt, you'll see an area called Mali. It's highlighted here in yellow. Mali is where the Dogon people currently live, and a lot of them believe they came from Egypt, and even some of their ancestors coming from northern parts of Mali, hunter-gatherers that all gathered into this community by the cliff sides. The lower map shows a trail, a stretch of land and property that they run, their village connects to from village to village along this mountain ridge, where they build their homes into the sides of cliffs, and they also build them out into the plains area. But each one of these represents a tribe. Is that right, Laird, within the Dogon?
Each one represents a village within a tribe of about 300,000 people.
Right.
Wow.
So, and it stretches for not that long. That's what, the 800 miles maybe?
Right. Largely along an escarpment. So it's cliffs similar to what you find in Arizona with the Hopi.
Right. Very similar to the Hopi. And the other thing is, and Jules, this might be of interest to you, every single one of them has a variation on their own language. It's just like here in the United States where we have different accents or different ways of saying things. Their belief systems, their spiritual practices are pretty much in sync. But their language, they got as many different language variations as some European countries, do they not, Laird?
They do. And also beyond that, their language is technically not classifiable because they are very careful about preserving discrete subgroups of words that relate to other languages. We have Turkish words and Tamil words, ancient Egyptian words. We have words that connect to Sanskrit in India. There are 18 different languages that are represented according to linguists. And so it makes it difficult to even place the Dogon language in a context in terms of other languages.
Yeah, like the Aussie Aboriginals.
Right.
There's a lot of tribes with different languages.
Yeah. And well, and we'll get into that in a little bit, because I tell you, the other thing about them is everything is verbal. They don't have a lot of written language or written transcripts, as I understand it. A lot of the regions around them have documentation dating all the way back to the 1400s that show and because they were influenced by the Arabs when they came in, the Muslims, the Christians.
Actually, the Dogon are reported to have moved away from the Niger River around 1500,
Right.
ostensibly to avoid conversion to Islam. They deliberately have never chosen to have a written language. They have the same outlook on written language that Socrates had, according to Plato. The idea is that they see written language as a degradation. They see it as a kind of a security breach waiting to happen. If you have information that's transmitted orally from generation to generation, you can control who hears it. If you write it down, now suddenly that control is lost. And so Socrates saw written language as a way for a person to represent that they knew a subject when they didn't really know it.
Yeah.
That's funny.
That's yeah. Next slide, Crystal. I was distracted by what's going on there in the chat room a little bit. Sorry about that. All right. So what we have up here on the screen are some photographs of today's Dogon tribe, and this is one of their mask dance rituals. They have they do consistently perform from village to village. They have their initiation periods, which we can cover later, where their young people in their tribe get handed down this spiritual information of their ancient teachings and wisdom. They go through a 3-month period of initiation. I don't know, is it every 12 years or every 20 years?
They have what they represent as a 60-year cycle, but according to the anthropologists, in practice, they actually they quote unquote make an excuse to do it every 50 years. They're trying to disguise the period of the festival. It relates to the orbital period of the Sirius stars.
This is going to be an interesting conversation. Because I was watching an interview with some of their tribal chieftains, spiritual leaders, who are very concerned that what they've been passing down will eventually get fizzled out, even though they have managed to fight off conversion to Christianity or conversion to Islam. Their young people don't want to go through the initiation. They don't. They're rejecting it, or they're pushing away from it and looking into the Muslim faith or looking into the Christian faith. And so this small group that has managed to be so pure with their gnosis over the years, centuries, are concerned that their youth will walk away from it and that the tribe will eventually die out. And I hope that's not the case. The lower pictures will show you how they live in the along the cliff dwellings and how they construct their houses. We have better pictures on the next slide. We'll show you. This is one of the villages on that chain. And you can see they're still working with stone. And is it mud?
Yeah, most of the structures are mud structures with, thatched roofs. But occasionally they do build houses from stone. And when they do that, they conform to a house plan that is also found around 3200 BC on Orkney Island at Skara Brae.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, and next slide. We'll show you a little bit more of the town. As you go through the town, you see there on the right-hand side, there's a mosque. So they do have a few of their tribe that are starting now or have been slowly converting over to the Muslim faith, but very few compared to the bulk. From what I understand, less than half. So they're still holding on to that, but they're coexisting, cohabitating with them quite well. And then in the internal, the bottom slide shows how the inside of these huts look. They're held up and supported by wooden beams as well as stone. It's almost megalithic style building that they're still doing, right, Dalibor?
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, they're fitting these blocks together. And their whole villages are made this way. Next slide. Okay.
Very similar to the Hopi style as well. I see a lot of similarities. Like that almost looks like Hopi right there.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that it?
Yeah,
Yep.
it does.
Yeah, right here, right, that one right there. Yeah, on the left.
They even will build their tombs in the side of these cliffs.
Oh yeah.
Temples or little chapels.
Right.
For prayer and service will be in the sides of these cliffs as well. So it looks massive, doesn't it? But it's a very small stretch of land when you think about it. Next one. Okay. This is some more examples that we pulled together of some of their rock wall art. And we'll get into their creation story here in a minute. But they believe their god came from an amphibian being from another star system. And they're very connected with Series B. And what you'll see on their masks and on the tops of their headdresses is that symbol up in the right-hand corner of the paws going up with the amphibian's paws in the air. and they wear that as their headdress. And that's Amon.
Ama.
Amma is their god. So you'll see almost every doorway that I could see throughout these villages, they all had a picture of Amma or something representing Syria on their door. It's fascinating, as well as the snake. And you can tell us the significance of the serpent.
Right.
Next one. So they also have on the lower part, you'll see these are samples of their worship centers. They're very small structures, but they come in a variety of styles and shapes, all of sandstone and sand and blocks. And they have a Christian temple right there in the middle for some of their tribe that has converted over to Christianity. So there's some blending there between the Christian faith and their original faith.
I just have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Laird, on this picture where you see the snake,
Right.
have you translated any of these paintings yourself to any level? Like when I see the snake, I almost want to think of that root chakra kundalini energy, or is it symbolizing the actual snake? What is your take on these paintings?
Okay, first what we have to understand about symbolism is the Dogon are talking about concepts of creation. And what they mean when they say that, they're talking about how the universe formed, how matter forms, and about the processes of biological reproduction and of consciousness. And they see those themes as parallel themes. And to emphasize that, they represent all of those themes simultaneously using a single progression of symbols. And what that means is that any given symbol has meaning for each of those themes. So you can't really properly ask, what does it represent? You have to ask, what does it represent if we're talking about biology, or what does it represent if we're talking about the formation of matter? But because the symbolism is parallel, the meanings are similar. This all rests on a philosophy of cosmology out of India called Samkhya, and Samkhya is a companion to yoga. So
Yes.
Samkhya and yoga express the same ideas, only from different perspectives. One is relating to biology, the other one's relating to how the universe and matter forms, but
Yes.
all using the same terminology and so forth. I have a daughter who studies Kundalini yoga, and very often she'll come to explain a concept to me, and she'll begin the sentence and I can finish it for her because it's all the same terminology.
Oh, that's so beautiful.
So yeah, the serpent is symbolic of energy that scrolls between non-materiality and materiality if we're talking about universes. But that connects biologically to concepts of Kundalini energy, things like that.
Lovely. Thank you.
And
Wow.
so I'm also interested in that same picture, but what's above the snake on the left-hand
Yeah,
side?
what is that?
The S-shaped snake there, sort of on the left-hand side of that building.
No. So yes, that one does interest me, but in the one that Crystal is talking about, so the top right, towards the left of the top of the picture, there is what looks like a ship above that.
Or
Looks
machine.
like a submarine.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, part of how we know what these symbols mean is because there are a lot of the Dogon cosmological words are ancient Egyptian words. And there's a set of approximately 30-some Dogon drawings that directly relate to ancient Egyptian glyphs with the same meaning used in to represent similar concepts. And so by exploring words that use those shapes, I was able to get a foothold into how the Egyptian hieroglyphs work. And as it turns out, the hieroglyphs, the Egyptian hieroglyphs are actually like Chinese hieroglyphs in that each symbol represents a concept. And the game that a scribe was playing when he decided to sit down and write an Egyptian hieroglyphic word was, he was trying to pick out of a body of 4,000 glyphs, he was trying to pick a set of glyphs that produced the right phonetic value from a spoken language, but at the same time where it combined concepts that expressed the nuances of meaning that he was trying to write in the word. So every word defines its own meaning. I'll give you a simple example. There's an ancient Egyptian word that talks about, that expresses the idea of the concept of a week, like days of a week. And the Egyptian word is written with 2 glyphs. It's a very easy glyph word. If I had perfect knowledge, I would have started working with that word in the first place. The first glyph is a circle with a dot in the center of it, which is the sun glyph. It can represent the concept of a day. And the second glyph is an upside down U that represents the number 10. So I looked at that word and I said, the glyphs of this word say to me 10 days. And I went and I did some research and discovered that the ancient Egyptians had a 10-day week. Wow. What are the chances that the glyphs of the word would telegraph to me before I even knew it what the meaning of the term was? And then I went to Chinese hieroglyphs and discovered their concept of a week was formulated exactly the same way. It was written with 2 glyphs, a sun glyph and their number 10, and they had a 10-day week. So at bottom we have toe-to-toe comparability between Egyptian and Chinese hieroglyphs in the earliest phases of those glyphs. So that figure of the snake relates to one of the Egyptian glyphs, which is a single wave glyph, and it represents the concept of matter in its wave-like form or of energy.
Brilliant.
And just above the snake?
I'm sorry?
The
And
figure
above
that
the
almost
snake?
looks like a centipede up above the snake, Laird.
It kind of does.
Okay,
Yeah.
that figure doesn't really correspond directly to an ancient Egyptian glyph, but anything segmented like that corresponds symbolically to the idea of multiplicity, the idea of what happens when energy takes material form.
Mhm. Excellent.
Okay. All right, next one, Lori. This is just showing you some of the interior work of some of the meeting centers or shrines. Notice their columns. We'll show you a close-up later, but they're carved out of wood, most of them, like trunks of trees that they use for their columns. And they carve into them figures and statues. The outside of these centers often have these reliefs, and they're blowing up one in the center. This is getting into their creation myth story, where they have the pneumo, is it?
Right.
Or they have the male and female, or sometimes it's a male that is both sexes, both male and female, represented, but it's usually in a pair. They're always in a pair, and they believe that their god, Amma, came down and mated with the planet Earth to produce offspring, and created the pneumo, which are the 4 pairs, and we can get into their creation story in just a little bit. So I just wanted to let you know what you were looking at when you saw these little figures carved in there. That's their representation of Amma on the right, which looks like a lizard, and then the created beings from that union of Amma with the planet Earth. The next one. Here's some more of that. You can see a little bit better, more clearly defined how they carved it into every single column. These pairs, right, Laird? Why would they do it for every single column?
Perhaps as practice for students who are being initiated. That happened in a lot of the centers, like on Orkney Island and Tepe, that every initiated class is learning certain skills. You see, at Göbekli Tepe, you have 20 or more different stone circles that are all pretty much the same, pretty much replicas of each other, with pillars in the center and carved animals and things. They've only excavated a small percentage of it. But what it looks to me as if it is final projects of stonemasonry classes.
Cool.
Same thing on Orkney Island. You have a stone circle that was there from very early times called the Standing Stones of Stennis, that the archaeologists believe that the 12th stone in the stone circle was never actually placed. But what it looks like to me is that as classes were graduated, more and more classes, that each class would actually unseat one of the stones, move it someplace else, then go excavate a stone, transport it, raise it in that slot. And so all that happened was that at the final stage of the process there, the final stone hadn't been replaced.
Wow. Jeez. Wow. Now, in the upper series of photographs, the three up top, this is a burial site. And they have the chamber, the tombs. And then they also will bury, not unlike the Egyptians and I guess other cultures, pottery, tools that the spirit might need when it comes back in its reincarnation into another life. I don't know to the extent that they believe in reincarnation, but sounds to me like they believe in you returning from matter into energy and then back from energy into matter again, so that the cycle repeats itself. So they carefully store these clay pots and jars up here on the ridge of the cliff to enable access for the afterlife, is what I was told. Now, I don't know if that's accurate, but I had read that.
According to the French anthropologists, the Dogon actually don't believe in reincarnation. That the only aspect that connects to the idea of reincarnation that they have is really relates to genetics, the idea of personal traits being passed down to offspring and to later generations. But definitely there's an afterlife aspect to the whole cosmology that gets symbolized in a number of different ways that also connects to the science of the creation of things like matter.
Interesting. They're so metaphysical. Go ahead, Mandy.
I'm very curious. On the left-hand side top photograph, there's what looks like a Maltese cross. Is that a symbolism they've put on that, or is that just something on the stone? It's like the four.
Yeah, that symbol, anything configured that way pertains to concepts of the axis of directionality that emerges with first structures of spinning energy. When the universe formed, according to science, the first coherent structure of energy that appeared were essentially sun glyph shapes. It was circles with a center. That's the way the energy configured. Same thing with when matter forms. That's the first geometric shape that forms. And so the Dogon associate with that the concept of an axis, which is the way that electromagnetism connects to itself perpendicularly. There are other aspects to it, but the symbol like that is just a stylized version of a sun glyph, basically divided into four segments to represent the four primordial elements: water, fire, wind, and earth.
Excellent.
Okay, next one, Lori. Okay, now the purpose of showing you these, this is Amma. These are the large sculptures of their god, and they're spread out all over all these villages. From what I understand, every photo I've seen, they're on a street corner or in front of someone's house or business. And if you take a look at the features of that, now they're not all Amma. They've got to be his partner, or who they represent as Earth, because I could see some feminine qualities too. But they all have that elongated, angular face, high cheekbones, jutted out chin, high forehead, high skull, and I haven't seen it documented anywhere where they practiced head binding.
No, I don't either.
No. And when I saw the live interviews with them, they looked a lot like this, but not as pronounced. Right. But it's in all of their art forms. And it's interesting because you know how the pharaohs obviously came from different cultures. Some looked more Asian. Some looked more African in design when they carved the pharaohs' faces. There's one in particular, I think it's in Karnak, if not Luxor itself, but it's in the side of Karnak, and it's another slide that shows that. We'll show you that face.
Sorry, Brandy asked a really good question about the other one, which was, are all of the eyes closed on those statues, the previous statues?
Almost like a mummy, like a burial mask. You know.
Good question. Don't
Mhm.
know.
And the other thing is, do you know anything about, so Aboriginal culture, they speak of the Mimi, which seem to take on a very similar shape as what they're describing here.
Yes. This is Kenya. My good friend from Kenya gave this to me, and I don't know if Lori can show it because we're in a, I don't know if it shows up in my screen over there, but it's the same. This is coming from East and Central Africa, and it's got the same elongated, it almost looks identical to what the Dogon are portraying there, with the long elongated skull and thin head. So if you go to the next slide, take a look at that one in the middle, you guys.
That looks like Akhenaten.
Right.
It looks like that's Akhenaten. Yeah.
Oh, that is Akhenaten.
Okay, I was gonna say it looks just like him.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. All right, now see the features.
Yeah, well, Akhenaten and his family had very odd body features, and they emphasized those. So we can't really make judgments about Egyptian culture based on them, because even in their time, they were not the usual body type of the culture.
No, but it's interesting though. This gets better and better. Take a look at these figures on the lower left.
Right.
Now they have a turtle. They have a tortoise shell, turtle bodies, amphibian type bodies. And when you take a look at their faces, they also have clearly not a turtle-like face. It's more like a marsupial type of face.
Looks like something out of the Dark Crystal, you know.
Does it?
Does.
Yeah. So you go on, and the that one on the right-hand side you have on the cover of your book, Laird, that Dogon symbol, is that supposed to be Amon or one of the Numo?
Actually, I don't have a take myself on what that figure represents, and some of the pictures in my books were selected by the publisher, not by me. If you know the name, if we can determine the name of any element of Dogon culture, we can understand what it represents, because the Dogon language rests on a set of syllables. These are sort of root syllables. They relate in English to 2-letter syllables or possibly 3-letter syllables, and every syllable corresponds to a concept, and the words are formed by mixing and matching those syllables together. So we don't really have to guess what a thing represents. Am is a syllable that represents the concept of knowledge, and Ma is a syllable that represents the concept of perception. Knowledge and perception are terms that relate to cosmology. If we're talking about matter, an act of perception is what causes matter in its wave-like form to transmute into a particle. Knowledge, if we think about it in the biblical sense, is an act of procreation, so it's the initiating act of biological reproduction. So we know simply by parsing those syllables of the name of Amma what Amma was intended to represent, and that's true with every Dogon word. It's also true of Maori words. I can most often infer what the symbolism of a particular Maori word is based on the phonetics. They follow the same phonetics as the Dogon, only with sort of evolution of language over a long period of time.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and go to the next one, Lori. Okay, so let's talk about their cosmology of creation a little bit better, Laird. They were the offspring of the union, the Numo, they called them, Nummo.
Okay, but before we talk about this, there's some misapprehensions we need to get past.
Good. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, there are different classes of Dogon myth that we have to consider. And we have to consider where a reference comes from. There's a class of Dogon myths that are public myths that are sort of fireside stories told at night among a group of people. And the purpose of those myths is to introduce some of the basic themes of the cosmology, to familiarize tribe members in a general way with some of the root symbolism of the cosmology, and to try to interest tribe members in learning about it. But the way that things are represented in those myths has been generalized and in some ways popularized, and doesn't really reflect what the ultimate version of the Dogon understanding is. Okay, now we have a second set of myths, which are the more inner myths that are learned by the initiates as they gain knowledge about the tradition, where the actual details of what the Dogon believe are. Then we also have a set of interpretations that were sort of overlaid by Robert Temple in his book, The Serious Mystery. Robert Temple only had access to a chapter or two of the anthropological study of the Dogon because that's all that had been translated into English at the time he wrote.
Right.
And so there's the whole remainder of the body of this 400-page anthropological study that he didn't have an overview of before he started talking about what he thought the Dogon symbols represented.
Ah, okay.
Now, in my field of study, the biggest threat to the work I do is what I call wishful interpretation. The human brain is wired in such a way that we tend to see patterns even where they might not really exist. And that's why children laying on the grass looking up at the sky imagine they see animals when there aren't actually animals there. It just looks like an animal to them. Okay, now the way I protect myself against my own wishful interpretation is I make a rule. And the rule is every interpretation has to begin with a flat statement on the part of the cultures I'm studying. That the Hindus say, you make some express statement about how a symbol represents, or the Dogon make a flat statement about what a myth represents, or whatever. I take that element, starting with that explicit definition of what one of the cultures thinks it represents, and then I sort of test that against what numbers of other cultures thought about the same element. And through that process, I can triangulate in on what an original meaning might have been. Now, in addition to that, I also have tools of language that help me sort that out. I told you every Dogon word explains its own meaning to me in terms of concepts. So I can get a sense of what the original intended meaning was based on the word that's used. At 500 BC, Confucius in China railed on for at great length about the fact that Chinese language, the words were no longer representing what they meant. He saw that as a great degradation of knowledge and language and culture in China at 500 BC. The ancient Egyptian words worked the same way. I was talking about how the glyphs of the words explain to you, if you understand what the symbols represent, they explain to you what the word means. There are actually some Egyptian words whose purpose is to assign a meaning to a particular glyph. So once you understand that, you can lay out a list of hundreds of Egyptian glyphs and what they mean based on the authority of the language, not the authority of somebody like me who guesses what it means.
Yeah, yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, yes. So in trying to sort out what the Dogon are really saying about certain concepts, the starting point is what the anthropological study says, which Robert Temple didn't have access to. Then you follow that up in any number of ways to confirm and sort of enhance what that meaning is. The Dogon also have pictures that go with certain concepts that tell us, add additional dimensions of information about what the concept means. So in the Dogon culture, when they're talking about cosmology, it becomes very quickly apparent that this is a scientific system. The only mythological character in Dogon culture who remotely resembles our traditional concept of a deity is Amma. And we can tell from Amma's actions in myth and from Amma's name and from attributes that Amma has, that Amma also is meant to represent scientific concepts, not actually represent a god or a deity. The philosophy is rooted in Samkhya in India, which is an expressly non-theistic philosophy. It spawned other later philosophies that were theistic, but it's flatly stated in the Samkhya tradition that we're not talking about God here. We're talking about science.
A quantum physical language to express antimatter and matter.
Well, and more than that, what was being presented to humanity starting at around 9,000 BC, and this may go much further back than that, but we have sort of a blocked evidence at the end of the Ice Age. But what was being presented at Göbekli Tepe at 9000 BC, in my opinion, was, and the Dogon say was, a civilizing plan for humanity, basically a way of organizing society, a way of organizing villages, a way of organizing life, very closely tagged to a symbolic cosmology. And the idea was that objects and animals and plants and things like that from everyday life of whatever culture they were educating were adopted as symbols to represent these scientific concepts, so that every time a tribesperson walked out of their hut, anything they saw in their surroundings or all the daily acts of life that they pursued were reminders of the science that they were taught.
Mm-hmm.
It was a self-reinforcing system. So yes, they are absolutely representing concepts of science. My first book, Science of the Dogon, is basically a side-by-side comparison of what the Dogons say about various stages in the formation of matter and what people like Stephen Hawking and Brian Greene say. In some cases, you can take the Dogon paragraph and the Dogon drawing and substitute it for Stephen Hawking's paragraph and his diagram, and you don't change Hawking's book.
That is just absolutely outstanding. Like these are a synchronicity on the multi-level and the quantum. Like that is so fantastic. That is
now
amazing.
They talk about things that we have direct ability to demonstrate that they're right about. To test whether they're right or not about. Talking about matter from its wave-like state in the quantum domain all the way up to an atom. They have a description of an atom correct. They know what protons, neutrons, and electrons are. They produce a correct drawing of an electron orbital shape. They understand as you step that down. Stephen Hawking says that as you get down to a certain level, there are more than 200 fundamental particles of matter. The Dogon say there are 266. The Dogon are not presenting theory; they're presenting what they were taught as fact. So that whole continuum from waves to atom represents a span of references that somebody like me can verify and correlate and demonstrate to my own satisfaction that they know what they're talking about.
Yes.
The purpose of that is to give someone like me confidence that when they now move into domains that are more fundamental than that, where popular science does not yet often even discuss the concept, it gives me confidence to pursue what they're saying and test it against the science that is available with the expectation that also will represent correct science, which it does. There's a reasonable scientific path from the level of a domain of pure energy to all the way up to the level of an atom that plays out in really sensible form, that is really scientifically reasonable, that when you look at it the way the Dogon do, all of the sort of the quantum weirdness filters out, and it's just like all evaporates.
It just becomes tangible. Yeah.
Yeah, if you look at it their way, you realize, hey, this is not so hard to understand. And second of all, it really makes a lot of sense. It's really very, very easy to understand. So when we talk about myths, which is where I started here, we need to be very careful to sort out how much of this is inference on the part of a person like Robert Temple and how much of it is what the Dogon actually say. So what I've tried to do is go through and trace those things down to what the actual Dogon statement is, what's quoted in the anthropological study, or what's quoted in any number of articles that the anthropologist wrote, and begin the interpretation with what they actually say, not with what someone imagined or someone interpreted them as saying.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's difficult to separate what's symbolic from what's literal. And so you also have to be careful that way to take since the symbolism is expressed in terms of animals and plants and so forth, you have to sort out, are they talking about what an animal does here, or a creature that actually looks like an animal or behaves like an animal? Or are they talking about a salient feature of that animal that's symbolic of a scientific concept or a principle?
Yeah, Laura, you can close that presentation out now. Thank you.
So when you get down to the bottom of it, I'm very fortunate in that I have two symbolic systems that are a very close match for each other, to the point that one is the Buddhist system, the other is the Dogon system, given in different languages. The Buddhist system is given in Sanskrit, the Dogon system is given in the Dogon language. And the systems are comparable enough that a modern authority on Buddhism is in substantial agreement about any concept or symbol as a modern authority on the Dogon. So it looks as if each tradition kept this complicated set of information straight for thousands and thousands of years. We know that the Buddhist system was documented in writing by around 400 BC. We know that the Dogon system is given in ancient Egyptian words that went out of use around 750 BC. We know that the Dogon civic practices are predictive of ancient Egyptian practices at 3000 BC. So these are both demonstrably ancient traditions that are a match for each other. They didn't get one didn't get it from the other. One didn't just copy it from the other. They both preserved it independently of each other. And what that means is we have cross comparability between the systems. So we get down to the bottom of the system, and if you ask the Buddhists, according to my go-to authority on Buddhism is a gentleman by the name of Adrian Snodgrass of the University of West Sydney, Australia, who is a world authority on Buddhist architecture and symbolism. And he says in one of the opening pages of his book, the Symbolism of the Stupa, he flatly says that the most sacred, quote unquote, most sacred of the Buddhist symbols are understood to have been gifted to humanity by a non-human source.
See, that was going to lead me to asking you about the serious connection. These, let's take everything that you just said and trace it back to the possibility of it literally coming from Sirius.
Okay, we'll get there. It's a slow process. The Dogons say that their tradition came from a non-human source also, that it was instructed to them. The Buddhists also feel it was instructed. But the Dogon take it a step further. They say not only were their teachers non-human, they were also originally non-material. Now, the problem that creates for a researcher like me is there are only two outlooks I can have on this situation. I can take the posture that, well, yes, both of these cultures managed to keep all of those elements straight all the way down through the millennia, but when it gets down to the question of who they got it from, they both somehow misremembered in matching ways who they got it from, which doesn't make sense to me. What makes more sense to me is that they both correctly remembered who they got it from. But if I take that stance, then I have to find a way of demonstrating the reasonableness of that. And so I ended up devoting an entire book to doing that. It's called Seeking the Primordial. And the purpose of that book is to lay the foundation for how it's thinkable that a non-material intelligence took material form and took action in a material frame to educate the Dogon about science.
Wow.
And to keep it right for thousands of years.
Right. Well, part of what keeps it right is a really, really incredibly capable set of teachers having framed it in a way that works. There's another book, the book I published last year called Primal Wisdom of the Ancients. The purpose of that book is to talk about all the different aspects of this tradition that reveal the hand of a very capable set of teachers here to say, here, look, they did this thing. Don't you remember your favorite teachers, the teachers you think of as being the best teachers you had, using the same technique to explain things to you? And just point after point where I'm just continually more and more impressed at just the extreme capability of whoever it was who put this system of symbols together, almost OCD and the way they approach subjects, so that you have a way of predicting how they think. One of the things my wife and I learned early about our infant son was that the more consistent we were about how we did things with him, the easier it was for him to learn what we were doing. That if you had a different ritual at bedtime than you did for nap time, he quickly figured out that, oh, this is the one where I sleep through the night.
Right. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Because this one was really interesting from a one of the elders. He says, according to their faith, Namo, N-O-M-M-O, Jules, N-O-M-M-O, Nam-mo, the spoken word, they call it. It's primary to understanding of our family and community, and it is at the basis of all of our naming of things. We cannot conceive that which does not exist. Every human thought expressed becomes a reality. In other words, it is spoken into being. Once we name it, it moves into existence.
Okay, now the way to understand that, okay, first of all, the word nomo or numo is a Dogon word. It relates to an Egyptian phrase, nu-ma. It's a compound word, like an English compound word. Nu is a term for non-material, how can I say this? It's a term for water or waves and non-materiality. Ma is a word that means to perceive. So the word nu-ma, expresses the idea the Dogon are telling us about their own teachers. This is the name for their teachers. Nu-ma is waves perceived. They're saying their teachers were non-materiality that took material form. Okay, now, to get to the specific meaning you were talking about, okay, put yourself in the position of a set of teachers who are going to teach very deep science to a group of people who don't really have a perspective on science. They don't have technology. You're going to teach very deep science to them, but really aimed at a future civilization that had enough technology to have a clue what you were talking about. So it's clear that the intended audience for this symbolic system was way, way, way in the future. Now, the way it works when you're teaching a thing, if you're using metaphors to teach a concept, that works, but it only works if the student has a frame of reference for the metaphor you're trying to use. If I frame a metaphor in terms of a TV show you never watch, you won't get the reference. So one of the quandaries for these teachers was, what kind of a metaphor do we pick here that's going to resonate with an audience thousands and thousands of years out? And so the way they solved that problem was they picked a series of metaphors and expressed the same ideas in terms of those multiple metaphors. And the metaphors they chose were cast in terms of things you find naturally in the environment and in nature and so forth, things that are not going to change over long periods of time. So they set up a group of 4-stage metaphors. The one you're most familiar with is probably water, fire, wind, and earth. One of the purposes of the metaphor is to help us be able to classify these. The symbolism gets very complicated. So by having those categories, you know that anytime they're talking about water, they're talking about a very early stage in a 4-stage progression of how matter forms. Anytime they're talking about earth, they're talking about something related to mass or matter. Okay, now another one of those 4-stage metaphors is given in terms of the plant world, the idea of planting a seed and having it produce a grown plant. A third one of those metaphors is related to the animal kingdom. It runs from insects to fish to 4-legged animals to birds. The one that pertains to the symbolism you're talking about is given in terms of, in relation to the idea of speaking a word, the process of speaking a word, starting with vibrations that turn into words. Okay, now anything that has to do with the spoken word, because it's a 4-stage metaphor that begins with vibrations and ends with the spoken word. When they talk about a spoken word, that we're talking about structures that are at the top of this symbolic continuum. And the Numo are the ones who taught about that. the idea of a spoken word is absolutely one of the metaphors that goes along with this instructed tradition that the pneumo instructed. So it makes sense to me that the word pneumo would relate to that.
Interesting. Wow.
It almost made me think of the 7 keys of the notes. You know.
Yeah. Now that's interesting because to get a little bit off topic here, Samkhya says universes form in pairs, and that there is a dynamic of energy that scrolls between the universes that is as essential to life in the universes as the natural water cycle is to life on Earth. The natural water cycle is a cycle where water evaporates from the ocean, forms clouds that rise up over the mountains, produce rain that then trickles back to the sea. Without that cycle of water, there would be no life on Earth. So the Dogon are saying the same thing is true about energy with the universes. Now, the dynamic of anything that crosses that boundary between the two universes is unity to multiplicity. But some of the specific examples that are given to illustrate that are white light that produces 7 rainbow colors, or a single tone that produces 7 notes of a musical scale, which is what Crystal was talking about. So absolutely, that's wrapped up in the same symbolism. Anything that expresses itself that way, beginning with one thing and producing a cluster, from my point of view, that's an indication that the essence of that thing really resides on the non-material side, and what we're seeing is a material expression of that thing.
Beautiful.
Now,
exactly.
The Dogon and Egyptian and cosmological words that I'm talking about express themselves in terms of those same kinds of clusters. That every word doesn't carry just one meaning, it carries a cluster of meanings, and the cluster doesn't really associate with the phonetics purely, it associates with the concept. So I can go to an entirely different language like Sanskrit, find the same concept that I'm researching, and realize that in the Sanskrit language, that same cluster of meanings associate with that word. And so those clusters give us direct comparability between the words of these languages. We don't need a linguist to say, oh, you haven't traced this through a proper etymology. We've got 2 clusters of discrete meanings, and the meanings aren't even predictable. You can't guess the secondary meanings by knowing the first one. So when you have a match on a set of different, widely different meanings that are the same in both languages, you have a lock.
Mandy, you had a question?
So is this going back to the word Nemo? Namo? So you actually have Numite, which comes from Greenland, and it only forms in Greenland. And I just find that quite interesting because Greenland is permafrost, which is the ice and water.
Yes, for me, that's evidence of the same tradition in a previous cycle. And there's other evidence of that preceded the Ice Age.
My question would be, since the Dogon had such an advanced knowledge of science and its theoretical aspects, science and cosmology and all that, why did they never apply that knowledge to technology, unlike, say, the Egyptians or the Chinese of the same period? How come they never put that knowledge towards like practical applications?
Because this goes back to my friend John Anthony West's concept of the Church of Progress. One of the misdirections of modern society is it makes us think that if things aren't changing and improving and progressing, that something's wrong. The Dogon have what I call a sense of enough. They have a perfectly livable, good life, and they understand that with no imperative to try to change that. In fact, their societal imperative is to preserve the original forms in the original forms.
No keeping up with the Joneses, thank goodness.
Right. Their job as a culture is to make sure these things don't change. And so none of these cultures, even though their symbolic systems are based on intense science, none of them was actually employing that science. Maybe the Chinese. I mean, some of them made forays into that. But if you talk to a Rene Guénon or someone like that, read Rene Guénon, who was an authority. he's one of the go-to sources of Adrian Snodgrass. In Adrian Snodgrass's book, he refers to Rene Guénon, whose perspective is from Hinduism, to explain certain ideas. Guénon says, anytime we're talking about what's obviously that kind of civilizing process, we're distancing ourselves from the actual core of the spiritual tradition.
Yeah, that's understandable. Yeah,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, if we were to adopt that same attitude towards in our society, for example, we would be speaking Elizabethan English. We would never have the kind of arts that we have today. We would never have the kind of art forms that we have today that are dependent on technology and digital media and stuff like that. So the question is like, can a society advance without technology or without applying the concepts that they know from these teachers that came from, say, a different star system or that were non-material in their practical day-to-day living?
That's right. That would put us in the same position as literally every other species on the planet that actually lives in harmony with it, rather than in opposition to it.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah.
So, I mean, whales, you don't see whale society progressing.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mandy.
At the same time, whales don't have world wars.
Right.
Go ahead, sweetheart.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mandy.
So I'm just really curious, because you've studied a lot of these ancient cultures that go back. Have you referenced some of these glyphs and symbols that you find against any of the ones that you find in the Aboriginal culture?
Yes. Now, let me talk about how we get to that. There are a couple of different paths to it. Okay. First of all, there's a potential that there was a much more ancient culture in Australia, in the region of Australia, prior to the Ice Age, which is always a possibility. It's very difficult to anchor that because of what happened with the Ice Age. It's sort of a blocked evidence. It sort of wiped all the evidence clean. 5,000 years from now, there would be no evidence of a skyscraper in New York City. So it creates great difficulties when we go back that far. Another complication is that in these root syllables that pertain to the cosmology, the syllable mu means ancestor. And so anytime a culture is talking about mu, it becomes problematic to sort out, are they simply talking about ancestors and their memories of actual living ancestors, or are they talking about a culture called mu? Okay. Now let's approach it from another perspective. We have three major paths of transmission for this tradition that pertain to what I study. There are more than that, but there are three major ones that pertain to my studies. It begins at 9000 BC at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey. The first path moves sort of southeast from there down into India, and it's carried forward by a group called the Shakti cult. The Shakti cult is a feminine tradition whose focus was on fertility. And all of the icons preserved by the Shakti cult, which is still a living tradition in India, are the same icons that you see in evidence at Göbekli Tepe itself. Now, I was talking about the fact that words carry clusters of meanings. The same is true for ancient Turkish words. For instance, in the modern Turkish language, the word tepe has 25 separate meanings. Okay, so when that's the situation, you can get different authorities translating words in various ways. But one of the traditional translations of the name Göbekli Tepe is Potbelly Hill.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that in modern Turkish, the word Satan means for sale. And you see that a lot in the classified ads here in Germany, placed by Turkish people. Satan means for sale.
And the word mitzvah refers to circumcision.
Really, does it?
Yeah. Now,
as in bar mitzvah.
At Göbekli Tepe, so we have that term that means Potbelly Hill. Well, with the Shakti cult, one of their icons is a clay pot that gets filled with water to represent a womb called a potbelly. This is what we're talking about. This is a direct link to the feminine tradition, that fertility tradition at Göbekli Tepe at 9,000 BC. So we have that path of transmission, and according to Federico Briganti, who's the go-to authority on the Shakti cult, the influences of that cult extended south and east as far as Australia. And so you have an Aboriginal tradition that's also matriarchal, that also originally focused on fertility, that looks like it might have derived from that same path of transmission.
Wow.
In the Shakti cult, the primary deities of the Shakti cult are two female goddesses who are considered to be the two mothers of Ganesha, the elephant god. Just tuck that away for later reference. Now, the second path of transmission out of Göbekli Tepe proceeds south along the coast of the Mediterranean through Palestine and down into Egypt. It looks like there may have been a direct connection between Göbekli Tepe and Egypt at 9,000 BC or 10,000 BC, because one of the classic traditions of the Shakti cult is to carve animal images out of natural outcroppings of rock, which is what the Sphinx is. Also, because if you accept the idea that the Sphinx pointed to the constellation Leo at 10,000 BC, and the three pyramids, large pyramids, reflected the image of the belt stars of Orion in that same era, then again, for a researcher like me, I have two choices. I can either say that those alignments were set at 10,000 BC when those constellations were in the right position, or else I can imagine that somewhere later on down the line, someone had the capability to retrospectively calculate what the alignment should have been. And I don't believe that's true. Okay, so it looks like there was a direct connection in Egypt at 10,000 BC. The third path of transmission is the one that I trace in my book, Tracing Orkney's Origins. The Orkney Island, if you know what it is, it's an island to the north of Scotland that's considered to be very remote. Some of the very earliest megalithic structures in all of Europe and the United Kingdom were raised there. There was a documentary conducted by the BBC in 2017, I think is when it aired, where they conclude that there were very interesting things going on that people don't completely understand on Orkney Island at 3200 BC or just before and after. Okay, so the problem with Orkney Island is you have a lot of establishing elements there that connect to Göbekli Tepe. I can see it's the same tradition. I can demonstrate that it's the same tradition, but I had no clue how did the tradition make its way that great a distance over that length of time to Orkney Island, and how can we credibly represent that it did that?
Right,
So
and much less a princess of, like a princess in Egypt being over in Scotland sitting on a throne. Like,
right.
How does this happen?
Right.
It's not out of the question. I mean, they had seafaring vessels.
Yeah, but
right.
It just.
But the problem is that it's so early that dynastic Egypt hadn't even become a thing yet. So I had a very hard time imagining that at 3600 or 3200 BC, anyone in Egypt was in a position to mount an expedition to Orkney Island to establish a megalithic school, basically. So I wanted to understand how this path of transmission worked. The problem with the researchers on Orkney is they take any one of these establishing elements, they examine it, they think about it, they decide, okay, say they take the architecture of the original stone houses that were built on Orkney. They look at it, they compare it to everything they understand in nearby Europe and Scandinavia, and they conclude this is an unknown form. No other culture built houses to the same plan. We don't know who built it. It turns out the Dogon do, and once you understand that, then certain connections start to be able to be made. But they do that with every element. They understand that certain of the elements originated in the Fertile Crescent region at sometime before 6000 BC, but they say, well, look, that's very far distant from here. This element might have made its way to us by any number of paths. It might have come across Europe, it might have come across the Mediterranean, any number of ways that it might have been brought here, and it might have been brought at any period of time. So they can't conclude anything from it. I
Well,
took
when
a
you have,
different-
I just think if you have multidimensional, beings that can go across all timelines and times, I mean, there would be an influence that goes across the entire, innate, cultures and traditions, the Hopi, the Aborigines, the Egyptians, Göbekli Tepe, and like it all to me is like conglomerated into this like almost like a single source of influence.
Right now, I can't argue that that's not true, but I also can't anchor that opinion in a way that's credible to me, or certainly not credible to a scientist. So
yeah, exactly.
I took a different approach to the Orkney establishing elements. I could see there were architectural elements, agricultural ones, there were symbolic ones, there were ritualistic ones. There were maybe half a dozen different clusters of elements that everybody agrees were there from the very start, but nobody knows where they came from. So what I did was I demonstrated that all of those clusters originated in the Göbekli Tepe region at the same time, and then I traced those clusters of elements island to island across the Mediterranean through Malta and on to Orkney Island by 3600 BC.
Yeah, it could have been like a breakaway civilization that was traveling from island to island, that was just dissatisfied with where they had originated and said, this place sucks and we're going to move. And they moved to a different place and they didn't like it there, or they were chased out. So they moved over to a different island, and then they moved again and wound up in Orkney.
Right. Now, I have the advantage of another aspect of this stuff in that the researchers in the Mediterranean have a different perspective. What they say is they can see without a doubt that someone was deliberately colonizing the major islands in the Mediterranean for agriculture, and they were doing it. These researchers don't say it, but I can see it and demonstrate it, that though the colonization effort was made using these same clusters of elements that I'm tracing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because also in Malta you have the hypogeum, you have the underground architecture, the underground houses, just like you have on Orkney.
Okay, let me tell you something interesting about the hypogeum. One of the early discoverers of that, these are a series of caves that are under a hill where they discovered the statue of the sleeping goddess. That is the sleeping goddess of Malta, which is a classic figure.
The same as the house plants for the Dogon and the Orkney people. Right
now, the name in the Maltese language is Hal Saflieni.
Yes.
Now, this researcher who was involved in the discovery of the site and the first one to write about it back in like 1912 or earlier, he makes a comment. He says one of the confusing things is this site, which sits under a village that was situated there for centuries above it before anybody knew that the site was underneath it, is termed Hal Saflieni, which in the Maltese language means low-lying village. But it's associated with a hilltop village. Why would they name it low-lying village when it's associated with a hilltop village?
Mm-hmm.
When you go to Orkney Island, there are two ancient languages that are documented to have been an influence there. One is a language called Norn, which is based on Norwegian word forms. It doesn't connect to any of the stuff I'm talking about. The second language is called the Faroese language. And in the Faroese language, the words Hal Saflieni mean cave or hall of the sleeping one.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Oh my God. That's profound. That is profound.
Now also on Malta, you have
the Giganteum.
Yes, you also have a series of megalithic structures there.
Mm-hmm.
One of them, the name in the Maltese language means standing stones.
Yeah,
when you go to Orkney, the ancient name for Orkney was Orkneyjar, which no one knows what it meant or why it became the name of the site. But in the Faroese language, Orca means how can I say this? To persist or to stand, and Kajarni means stones. So
Cajun-
Orkney was originally named
Cajun.
Standing Stones, probably in honor of the Standing Stones of Stennis, but that's another connection that's sort of homage to Malta. Every establishing element we find on Orkney, what you also found on Malta in the immediately preceding era.
And it's also interesting that Maltese is the only European language that's based on a Semitic root. It's the only Semitic language spoken in Europe.
Wow.
But I don't know if that pertains to the ancient Maltese language, in other words, the language of the builders of structures like the Gigantium. But it's definitely like an interesting thing.
Okay, now there's another really interesting thing about Malta that I think it's worth diverting into discussing here, even though it's off topic. I see evidence from various perspectives that the tilt of the axis of the Earth has shifted over time, that periodically it shifts.
Greenland used to be green.
Right, and there are petrified forests of the size that Lewis and Clark found on the west coast of the United States when they first arrived there at Antarctica. You can't grow a tree like that in the latitude Antarctica is at. Okay, now in Malta, they have 3 sets of 3 megalithic structures that all conform to the same plan and that were all rebuilt in parallel with each other. There's an engineer in Malta who's done studies of these sites, and what he says is, okay, the way the structures are shaped, they have a curved back wall and they have a very narrow entrance at the front. And the way the structure is constructed, the entryway works in the same way that the lens of a camera works, that it serves to focus the image of the sun on the back wall of the structure. And so he interprets the structure as being agricultural in purpose, that the purpose was to track the motions of the sun across the back wall. The thing is that that kind of a structure only works if the opening is an appropriate number of degrees for the latitude of the structure. If I were going to build one of those today at the equator, I would need the opening to be 23.5 degrees, which is the tilt of the axis of the Earth. The thing is that over the period of 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years, as they rebuilt these structures in parallel with each other, they changed the size of that aperture, which implies that Malta shifted its spot on the planet. They recorded in stone what the tilt of the axis had been in those eras.
So they must have, so they took into account that, which means that they must have known about the precession of the equinoxes, about precessional numbers, and encoded those somewhere into their architecture as well, just like the Egyptians did for the Great Pyramid.
Well, get this, they didn't have any tools, not like we do. What the heck did they use?
Supposedly, yeah.
Now, we can demonstrate that the purposes of those structures was not agricultural. There's an easy way to demonstrate it. It's because from the era of Göbekli Tepe on, there was a much, much, much simpler way to judge the seasons, the motion of the seasons for agriculture. You can see it. What the technique was to deliberately place sites in view of a mountain. Originally, it was a single elephant-shaped mountain, but eventually it became 2 elephant-shaped mountains with a gap in between. That you could observe the setting of it or the rising of the sun against the backdrop of that mountain and just track with your eyes where you were in the season. You knew when to plant and when to harvest just from that. Well, at Malta, from those same sites, you have a perfectly clear view of an island called Filfla that serves that same function. It has associations with elephants. It looks like a sort of a squared elephant shape, and the sunset sets behind it in that same manner. They even have a megalithic window framed out to view it from solstice to solstice.
Oh yeah, that's the little island off Gozo, right?
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
There are caves there with the bones of pygmy elephants in it.
Yeah, that's an anomaly in and of itself. Like, how did those elephants get there? Yeah.
Well, a long time ago, there may have been a land bridge.
Because they're native to India. Yeah.
Right.
Uh-huh.
So lots of ways to make connections back and forth. But what we were talking about was the paths of transmission. Okay, because of those paths of transmission, I can see that there are influences on Australia sometime between 9,000 BC, sometime after 9,000 BC, of the tradition that I'm pursuing. And I can see it reflected in the Aboriginal culture. That doesn't preclude the possibility that there were earlier influences on Australia. And that's right now the most I can say about it is, yes, I can see the influences. That's a very long way of answering the question. Can I see influences? Yes, I can.
Yeah, it's just very interesting, because I see a lot of correlations between the masks of the Dogon people. So just some of my study and stuff. So the Aboriginal people talk about the Mimi figures, and they were put in 1200 Kaya, which a Kaya is 1,000 years ago, but it's exactly the same as like these Dogons, and they were actually found in a similar place just outside of in Africa, of these early human skeletons that they brought up and everything. So because I was just really interested, because you seem to have picked up like to the Egyptian, the Chinese, the Maori cultures, and the African cultures, and I just believe they all have a link to Australia. So I was just like really interested in how they correlated between them.
Right. Now, from my perspective, and even from the traditional timeline of things, the Orkney instructional tradition preceded the Egyptian dynastic Egypt by a couple hundred years. And when you go to Abydos in Egypt, someone recreated key elements on Orkney in the way they founded things. They placed a cemetery in the same alignment view of two mountains with that gap. Let me try to explain to you why that's important cosmologically. Cosmologically, we say we have a non-material universe and a material one. I was at first confused because when I was researching Egyptian concepts of time, I discovered that there were two Egyptian time glyphs. Why would they need two time glyphs? Its reason is because time on the non-material side expresses itself as an oscillation, an in-out oscillation. Time on the material side is a linear vector. Okay, one of the huge conceptual thrusts of this tradition is trying to reconcile those two modes of time. My belief is that when we come down to how events occur and whether even how events are interpreted with things like the I Ching, how linear time reconciles with that oscillation of time affects the outcome.
Interesting.
Now, the thing about Orkney is that Orkney had natural alignment to two mountains on the island of Hoy, across the water from where the standing stones of Stennis are, across the water from where a pillar was raised called the Watchstone. And if you stand at the Watchstone on the equinox, the sun sets squarely between the two mountains. So what you have there is a dynamic of sunrise to sunset that's symbolic of the linear mode of material time that intersects with the oscillation of time of the seasons that's behind the mountains. And so what you set up symbolically is a representation of that very pivotal concept of energy that relates to the cosmology. At Abydos in Egypt, they recreated the same thing at Abydos. According to Om Seti, the original name of Abydos was Abdu, which meant the desired mountain. It was founded there because of the mountain. When Akhenaten founds his relocated capital, he positions it in direct view of a similar set of mountains, only these are in relation to sunrise rather than sunset. But he also sets a pillar that you can observe the sunrise against the backdrop of these mountains and do the same thing. If you go to Elephantine in Egypt, Elephantine Island is set in view of a single elephant-shaped mountain that looks like a reclining elephant. And I have copies of text messages from modern residents on Elephantine who say, well, I guess summer's approaching because I can see where the sun's rising behind the mountain. In Hinduism, they flatly say that that was a deliberate consideration, that they deliberately located their important sites in view of mountains like that. And you can find examples of it all over the world. You can find it all the way up through the Hebrides to Orkney. You can find where stones have been placed to be able to observe these events from the mountains in the distance.
And
Bird's
Laird,
eye
I was going to ask you, have you been physically to some of these places that you've discussed?
My outlook always was, okay, first off, my work begins with these like 30-year studies that true authorities on these subjects developed. And the reason they developed them was so that in the hopes that somebody later on down the line was going to take this huge body of information and do something with it.
Yeah.
So my main thrust has been to be the person who tries to do that.
Okay.
And I always said that when I had a very good reason to visit someplace, I would.
Yeah.
The only place that I have gone out of my way to visit is Orkney.
Orkney, of course.
Orkney a couple of times, and to the Faroe Islands, and I've been to Peru, to Lima, Peru. My daughter lived there for about a decade.
Oh, beautiful! It's beautiful there.
John F. West was always trying to get me to go to Egypt with him, but the way my profession was, I couldn't really afford to take that much time off to do it, so I never went.
Sorry, where did you say your daughter lived? What's the name of that place in Peru?
I was at Lima, Peru, the city.
Okay.
Where there are all sorts of ancient constructions in Lima, more in Cusco, but I never got to Cusco.
I've always wanted to go there. That's on my list of absolutely must go is Peru. Absolutely. That's fantastic.
Peru is also where they found the paracas, so your elongated skulls.
Skulls. I was thinking that earlier. Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah.
And I think it's quite funny you mentioned the whales before, because I also believe that the whales are connected with Sirius as well.
I think they're connected. Okay, now let's get to Sirius. Before we get to Sirius, I want to connect the Peru thing too. On Orkney, okay, what it looks like we had on Orkney was an instructional site for cosmology and agriculture. The series of megalithic sites on Orkney, okay, imagine that you stepped onto an island like that and you discovered 5 of the 6 first letters of the alphabet in the right sequence carved in stone. It wouldn't be hard to figure out that someone was trying to place the letters of the alphabet there. What I found was a series of megalithic sites that were all connected at 3200 BC by a road that led to the Scarabray village that reflect what we can call the alphabet of key shapes in the formation of matter, according to the Dogon, in sequence, built to a human scale, so that essentially a person could walk through these shapes the same way back in the 1990s they used to bring sort of traveling tours into the shopping malls where you could walk through the organs of the human body and learn about biology and stuff like that. So on Orkney, somebody was doing that at 3200 BC. About within 300 years after that, really by around 3100 BC, about 100 years after that, suddenly we see appearing in 4 locations around the world are agriculturally based kingships that in each case arise against a backdrop of what looks like no development. We don't have any evidence of how did this come about. In Egypt, it was called Taru. In China, it was called Iru. In Ireland, it was called Aru. And in South America, it was called Peru.
But there's also the Hill of Tara in England.
Right. Sorry. Now, those words in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language refer to the 4 cardinal points. The phonetics refer to the 4 cardinal points of north, south, east, and west. But they also alternately refer to 4 stages in agriculture, from an uncultivated field to a planted field to a field with growing plants to grain stored in a granary. So again, the language tells us what happens. It looked like the instructional tradition on Orkney ended up producing those agricultural kingships.
Sorry, I find that really interesting too because of Uluru. are in the middle of Australia, which I've always seen as a seed. And the fact is too, I believe the constellation of Leo is sitting just over it at the moment too.
Okay,
And
now
the
we
mountain
need to
that lives behind me is Muru. Muru is the mountain that I live on. Muru.
Okay, so Mu is a term for ancestor, and Ru is a term that means the foremost part of something. So these are the primordial ancestors.
Well, where I live is the Aboriginal birthing pools, which is all jasper, but also Muru in the Gubbi Gubbi tribe means living and alive.
Okay. I can see how that connects.
Yep.
Now, what I wanted to get to was Sirius. The knee-jerk impulse when it comes to when the Dogon talk about Sirius is to think, well, they have advanced knowledge. They're doing all these things that seem very strange for the time. Looks to me as if their teachers came from Sirius. That would be the easy answer. It's not what the Dogon say happened. So then why are the Sirius stars so important to the Dogon? It's a question that has to be answered. Well, one of the absolutely pertinent keys to this whole energetic structure of how matter forms is understanding that there's parallelism to the stages of it. And the only way we're going to understand that is if someone can demonstrate that there's parallelism to it. There's also parallelism to the domains, the macrocosmic versus our domain versus the microcosmic. So one of the thrusts of the Dogon tradition is to try to illustrate for us in a convincing way that that's true. So this is going to be a long story again. In the Dogon creation myth about how the material universe gets formed, there's a character named Ogo. Okay, Amma creates the non-material universe. Amma is an affectionate nickname that Ganesha referred to his mother by. His mother, Sati or Parvati, was called Amma. Okay, Amma creates a non-material domain, which is symbolically feminine. Ogo creates a material domain. Now, Ogo, the actions of Ogo in the myth are the attributes of light. The equivalent Egyptian word is Aku, which means light. So one of the things that Ogo does is he measures out the universe in 8 billion steps. Now, I know that the word step is code for a cubit. That's one of the definitions of a cubit. A cubit is either the distance from your elbow to the tip of your finger, or alternately the average pace or step of a person. So it looked to me as if I know that the universe does not measure 8 billion cubits in radius or diameter, but one of the figures that was commonly given for a long time for the radius of the visible universe was 8 billion light years. So I go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and discover that one of their words for cubit was akumeh, literally light measure. So now I have confirmation that we're talking, when we say cubits, we mean light years. So then I ask myself, well, how did we even know how long an Egyptian cubit was, what the length of it was? And I realized they inferred that from the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. So the Great Pyramid measures 440 royal cubits per side of its base and 280 royal cubits high. So that left me with information, but not very much to go on. What do you do with that information? I know my friend Robert Bobal feels that the 3 large pyramids at Giza were meant to represent the Orion's belt stars. So out of desperation, because I had nothing else I could do with it, I went to a search engine and typed in the word Orion and the number 440 and the number 280 and turned up references to a very faint spiraling birthplace of stars called Barnard's Loop that centers on the belt stars of Orion and measures 440 light years by 280 light years.
Laird, on a personal, like energetic level, everything that you're talking about is just making me go, yes!
Yeah.
Well, me too. This is a daily
amazing
for me.
Jules,
Bingo.
Now,
Jules
the
is
Dogon referred to that structure. The Dogon also placed large stones on a plateau to represent stars. including the belt stars. And they say their purpose in placing the belt star stones are to point us to a structure they call the Chariot of Orion. And the French anthropologists who studied them imagined that that represented the whole constellation. But this birthplace of stars, which is what our sun came out of, it's part of the Orion Nebula. You can't see it with the naked eye. You can only see it with time-lapse photography. And when you image it, it looks like the wheel of the chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in. So now we have the Dogon Chariot of Orion. We also know that any culture that associates a wheel or a chariot with Orion was influenced by the same instruction. Because there's no objective reason to associate that constellation with that concept.
Wow.
Okay, so the Dogons say the reason that's an important structure to them is because they talk about the formation of a spiral of matter that exists at every point in space-time. They call it the Po Pilu. That spiral of matter is like a tiny vortex at every point in space-time. They say the reason that the Chariot of Orion or Barnard's Loop is important to them is because it's the macrocosmic counterpart to that tiny spiral of matter. And when you do the research, you realize the scientific definition of the Barnard's Loop is a match for how the Dogon described their little spiral. In other words, as above, so below. You've got a match.
Hang on just a second. Just a second. Jules, did you have a question or anything? I just wanted to make sure with you're okay? Okay.
Okay, the next piece of this is the whole system rests on dynamics of energy that are understandable. It's only a handful of dynamics of energy. What happens is, if we talk about virtual particles in the microcosm, in the quantum domain, what happens is you have little fluctuations of energy at the level of the root energy of the universe that are like ripples on the surface of water. But in the circumstance where there's a little bit of additional added energy to those virtual particles of the sort that's caused by observing them, according to Heisenberg, the virtual particles start moving around each other. The Dogon described this. They relate one of the particles to Amma and the other one to Ogo, and they describe how they move around each other, and they create an Amma-shaped structure that the Dogon relate to a seed that ends up sitting at the center point of what's spinning energy.
I love it.
That spinning energy is called, okay, first of all, the virtual particles, when they come together in that almond shape, that's a dynamic of energy called angular impulse. It's the same dynamic that's described by the two Sirius stars if you account for their motion through space. It's a crisscrossing action that creates a whole series of those almond shapes. That's exactly what energy is doing on the quantum level. So now the Dogon have pointed us to a second example of as above, so below that we can positively link. No question here that these two things go together.
Isn't that amazing?
Incredible. Incredible.
We eventually come around to the perspective that it doesn't matter what domain we examine this stuff on, the dynamics of energy are the same. You don't have to be able to see it on the quantum level. All you have to be able to do is observe it on our level, and you can infer what happens on the quantum level and even deeper than that, or on the universal level. It's the same thing.
That kind of ties in with Nassim Haramein's research on the Schwarzschild proton, which proved basically that every single atomic nucleus has a miniature black hole inside of it.
Right. That's another mode of conveying this. That's one of the primary.
And that's a spiral motion, yeah.
Right.
Oof. This is good stuff, guys.
As a matter of fact, if you look at the dynamics of a black hole, it's exactly the equivalent of that, only another level up.
Yeah.
It's the same dynamics of vortex as that, or as water that swirls down your drain, or a vortex of water in the ocean.
Yeah.
So doesn't everything follow a spiral shape? So the way that we see plants grow, they will grow to that Fibonacci spiral. The way which our fingerprints, everything, our ears, everything, it just goes round and has that spiral shape within our universe.
Now, the reason for that symbolism in the cosmological tradition is because what the Dogon describe, okay, they describe that almond shape as a gateway between domains. Their understanding is the first half that gets created in that spiral shape, the underside half, is the equivalent of what a hurricane does on the ocean. It'll hollow out a little space that looks like a boat.
Yeah.
That's how that
It
almond
does.
shape begins. And then after a period of time, when the energy gets strong enough, it sort of flips over on itself and encloses itself as a kind of a seed, and energy configures itself in between. But on either side of that, on the material side and on the non-material side, are two vortices that are spirals that work in the same way that a Torah scroll works. In fact, a Torah scroll in Kabbalism is symbolic of that scrolling energy. And so anytime you see those two spirals represented as a symbol, that's what they're representing, the non-material energy coming into the material.
See, that makes sense to me because on an inner cellular, my inner gnosis in my journeys, this makes sense to me, and it's just so refreshing to have the science and the language and the expressions to kind of paint what I can express the processes within my own nature and being of those expressions. You know, it's beautiful. Right. It really is beautiful.
No, it is beautiful, and I'm always impressed at how this plays out. The really interesting aspect of it to me is that, okay, I never had any sense that a Torah scroll was symbolic of anything.
Yeah.
One of the progressions of my process is coming to understand that things that I always thought were objective actually have symbolism to them.
Yes.
And the reverse of that many things, virtually every aspect of this tradition we're talking about that we understand as being symbolic, when you get down to the root domain of energy, becomes literal.
Literal.
It's not symbolic anymore. They've described literally what happens.
So cool.
Yeah,
Don't you just want to make you want to just go live with the Dogon for a while and just take it all in?
I must go to a festival in the desert in Mali. There is a festival in the desert in Mali. I've always wanted to go. Yeah. Take me.
This is the next aspect of what I was just talking about. We talk about the dynamic between an initiate and their informant in the Dogon tradition. Any person in Dogon culture potentially, or outside of Dogon culture, can potentially learn all of the inner secrets of the tradition if they have the impulse to pursue it themselves and to keep pursuing it.
Yeah, that's what their leader was saying. His concern is that maybe the older generation there in these villages have that. The younger ones that are coming up are being exposed to other things now that are driving them away from that desire.
Well, fortunately, it doesn't matter whether they all do it. It only matters that some of them do it. And the other fortunate thing is we seem to be past the bottom of the cycle now, and things should be getting better slowly.
Oh,
that would be great.
The dynamic between the student and the informant is, if I'm the student and you're the informant, and I ask you a question that you feel is appropriate to my educated status, you're required to give me a truthful answer.
Yes. Yes.
That's what's going to be.
Now, if I ask a question that's inappropriate to my status, you're required to remain silent. Now, that dynamic is not just the dynamic of the esoteric tradition. That's also the dynamic that some people I know who are intuitive healers have. It's their relationship with non-materiality. They pose a question, and if it's appropriate to their sort of pay grade, they get an answer back. If it's not, they don't. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so that whole entire process of initiation of the initiate by their informant is training the initiate to that mode of communication with non-materiality. Yes. So that by the time they come out the other side, they've got it. They grasp it. They're completely adept at it.
Yep.
This is not symbolic. It's literal. It becomes literal.
Well, I would posit that the vast majority of that Dogon knowledge is encoded within their language, and that the basic thing that you would have to do would be to first learn the language, learn the Dogon language, not Malenke, which is spoken in Mali, but Dogon, and then begin the process of like learning the esoteric stuff.
Yeah, and actually, without doing the kind of comparative work that I've done, you can't really get at it. And Rene Guénon flatly says it. He says there is no perspective from which a person can arrive at an initiated perspective working from study from books or without the active participation of an informant, that it can't be done. But the truth of the matter is it can be done, but it can only be done by comparison through a bunch of sources. Also, I can only describe my process. Originally I described myself at 18 years old, if you sort of directly out of the box, as the least spiritually connected person I knew. None of this was a thing for me. It was all transparent to me, nothing, no connection, no sense of it.
Yeah.
Since I started the process, I've lost count of the number of active assists that have helped me out in this. Some of them very objective and witnessed by other people, and some of them very subtle.
Profound. That's
but
profound.
To the point where for the last year or so, quite frequently I'll be researching something, and I'll have some person I don't really know contact me and say, boy, I had the most vivid dream. Can you help me figure out what this dream means?
I was just thinking that, Laird. Get out of my head, sir.
I'll do the research to sort out, dreams play out in terms of these same clusters of meanings as the language has. So I can use a Dogon dictionary, or an Egyptian or a Dogon dictionary, to triangulate in on what a dream means. So when I do the work to interpret the person's dream, I discover that what the dream is about, it directly relates to the thing that I'm trying to study or write about. And quite often it'll open up a whole other aspect of it that I didn't know about, that I then write about. But over the last year, it has felt distinctly like an effort to collaborate. It's as if there's an intelligence that wants to participate in the writing of the book. It's like as if I was writing a chapter, and my little sister was tugging on my coattail saying, here, I have an idea. Can we include this? Only it's a very insightful little sister.
Yes.
You know, when you love life, life loves you.
Yes.
That's right.
I say that
well, folks, we are approaching 2 hours. We've been doing this for about an hour and 53 minutes, and we could do it all night.
All night with
Laird. All night, man.
I could. Get me the coffee. I'm ready to go.
So
please feel free to contact me through email or by Facebook.
Oh, I will.
My email address is my last name, ScrantonLR at AOL.com, until AOL ceases to exist.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And you're on Facebook. You also have we have links to your books and your research. Is that what that is? Your research database or something? Archive, or plus you're on all the heck over the place, like coast to coast.
Right. Now the selling of the books can't be a primary thrust of this. That the process works in large part because there isn't an intention to privatize this. You can't make this as information that belongs to everybody. The ancient Cretes knew that. In the ancient Crete, all this information was set right out in the open where everybody could learn about it. It's not proprietary information. Anybody who tries to tell you that a piece of it is, or try to treat it like it is not the real deal.
No.
Agreed.
I just get a lot of value out of it, and it really helped open my mind when I read some of your materials, and I can't wait to dig deeper into Scarabray and what you're doing with Scotland. And I have questions about the Celts and their involvement. And Mandy, did you get your questions answered?
Yes.
You did sufficiently about the Australia?
Now, before we go, who else? Is there anybody else who has a question they really wish they could have talked about?
No.
All my questions would lead to more discussions that would take, take hours and hours.
I will email you because we could go on for another 6 hours.
The Faroe Islands.
I'd be happy to come back sometime. We can talk for another couple of hours if you want. But I expect you all to bring really good questions, like you have.
I do. I have some really deep, profound questions.
Well, we'd love to have you back for part 2. Are you kidding?
No.
I would pass out with excitement.
Because now you've given people enough to, hey, I need to ask him. Ooh, I wanted to ask him. So now we'll have a list of questions we can shoot over to you.
And the really hard questions.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
No. I've got some hard questions for you after this.
Oh, yes. You want hard questions? We're coming after you.
Don't be afraid to email me. I'm happy to talk by email.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay,
That's
excellent.
I have
awesome.
your email. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you so
So-
much.
And also, let's see.
You said your
We
books are
just-
available through.
I found a lot of his stuff on Amazon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all on Amazon if you want it.
Yeah.
There's an Intertraditions author page for me. There's a Simon and Schuster author page for me. YouTube has links to a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
He's not loaded into the Crystal Network yet, but he will be. As soon as
will.
we,
Yeah,
as soon as we connect with Karen, we'll put all Laird's stuff on there, and then
absolutely.
you could go there if you're researching. You can just pop on one of his links and.
One point of interest is
Mhm.
I self-published the first book, and I was sending out targeted emails to groups and people I thought might be interested. And one of those emails reached John Anthony West when he was leading a tour.
Yeah.
Well, when he got back to the United States, he realized he only lived about 45 minutes south of me. So one night he phoned me. My wife saw his name on the caller ID and thought, gee, what is it? John Anthony West is on the phone. So we talked for about 45 minutes until I finally offered to send him a copy of the book. He was upset that I was going to make him buy the book. Then he invited me down to his house, both of us down to his house, his apartment in Athens, New York, to meet him one January morning in the snow. And I got there and discovered he had arranged for a videographer to film the whole meeting. And that meeting became episode 8 of the Magical Egypt documentary series. I had no idea before I walked in that here I think I'm meeting this guy who's one of my idols. And now what, they're going to film it?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, you know, I the only thing I didn't get to ask was I was very interested in we can email later, but I was really interested in this path of migration that seems to have possibly occurred since way back when, from the South African Zulu tribes up the Nile, perhaps, or even up through the sea and into the Red Sea, all the way up to as far as Egypt itself, and helping. They claim that they had a hand in building the Sphinx. They claim that their ancestors may have had a hand in building certain aspects of the plateau there in Egypt. And then later, I guess to avoid Muslim invasion, some headed west into Mali and others dropped south into Nubia. But there's been I can't seem to find any reference or anything solid from any studies on that. It's just by word of mouth. Our ancestors had a hand in building the Sphinx. They talk about a giant lion that was a guardian, on the plateau, and they describe it. They described it to Khadijah when she talked to them. So I would just like to know what your thoughts are, and on anything that you've studied so far leads you to believe that any of that may have originated from South Africa.
Certainly there are influences farther down in Africa, south in Africa, from where the Dogon are. I can track the tradition that connects the Dogon out of Orkney back to Crete by around 3000 BC. It looks like they were way pre-Minoan Cretes were educated at Malta and founded the school on Orkney, and then sent a contingent back to Crete.
Okay.
And those became the ancestors of groups that the Garamantes in northern Africa, who are just west of Egypt. The Garamantes have a lot of the Dogon symbolism, a lot of the Dogon language, and are connected genetically. And so it looks like the Dogon may have emerged out of the Garamantes. And also all the words, all the language connects. Using the Faroese language, all these terms that are ancient Cretan terms and ancient Greek terms that they don't have etymology for, and they surmise, well, maybe it connects to this Egyptian word, just play right out if you look at the Faroese language.
Interesting.
In fact, there's a bay that the Skara Brae site overlooks called the Bay of Scale. And it's shaped like the same crown shape as I'm trying to think, there's a constellation that represents a crown. And there's an ancient myth about tossing a crown up. It comes out of the Near East of tossing a crown up into the heavens after a marriage. I think it was Ishtar's wife or something. Okay, now on Crete or nearby Crete, there's a similar bay shaped the same way, using the Cretan name for crown, which is Corona. The word scali means crown, but there's a second word in the Faroese language that's Corona that also means crown. So you have very often an intermingling of Cretan words and what are these cosmological terms in the Faroese language that explain all this stuff.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's fantastic.
It's amazing.
I just find it quite interesting that you said it was the corona, and then you also mentioned previously it's almost like people have stopped us from connecting this last year and sharing our knowledge, and there's the coronavirus going on and they want us to keep 6 feet apart or 1.5 meters depending on where you live. So I just find that quite interesting how it all links in, especially like the energy and how they...
Well,
I think the kittens are out of the bag. It's a little too late to stop that.
Sankhya points out that there is such a thing as everyday coincidence also, so we have to be careful about that. And the other thing is that in my experience, meaningful synchronicities come with self-confirmation of meaning in one form or another.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the ways that you can identify that this is genuine as opposed to just everyday coincidence. And so my job is always to try to find that way to anchor the reference.
Yeah, beautiful.
This is true.
Absolutely beautiful. This
Such
was
a pleasure.
absolutely an honor
Such a
for me
pleasure.
to hang out here with you guys. Thank you so much.
Laird, Audrey was just saying we got to get Annie XD and Laird together, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that would be mind blowing.
And he actually came to an event I held a few years back. I did a day of instruction at Vassar College, and he drove over from Boston and attended that.
You guys would just rock together. We could just sit back and pop popcorn and just sit there and watch the whole thing.
I'd be happy to do
That's awesome.
If I could ever get him back, I would. We'll have to talk to him about it. That'd be pretty cool. That would be awesome.
Yep.
All right, folks. Well, we have
Laird,
to
thank
wrap
you
it
for
up.
your time.
Yeah, thank you all
Thank
for
you
your
so
time
much.
and your interest and your really good thoughts and your background in this material.
Yeah.
Really
Well, we'd love to have you back, and we're going to add you in and start communicating with you. Maybe we'll be able to collaborate on some discussions about things as they come along based on your time. I know you as an author, you've got a lot on your plate, but
well, I'm retired, and depending on how things go with the Indian version of the virus, things may be quiet.
No, get back.
No.
Just so folks know, real quick here, Crystal, let's see.
Yes.
Friday night, we have a friend of Jules from Australia. And Jules is also a client of hers in terms of workshops. It's going to be titled, What is Maya Movement? M-I-A. What is M-A-I-A Movement all about? Featuring Julie May of Maya Wellbeing. I'm not going to give any more away than that. You guys
I can't wait.
You got to come Friday because it's kind of an interesting approach that she has to health and healing and maintenance.
Yeah.
So using movement as part of the regimen. Let's see what else we have. Nina the Mystic is having her merchant party with Crystal, Robert. I'm probably going to participate. It's on her Sunday at 6 p.m. East Pacific time on the 23rd. Let's see if I get a T-shirt. They've been kind enough to give me one. So I told her I would gladly participate in that. So that's coming up soon, and she'll be advertising it more, and we'll try to link into it when we get a chance. I told her we'd try to put her links in for it.
Okay.
Any other announcements that any of you have? We good?
Oh, just make sure we get over to the Crystal Network. Yes, thank you. And make sure you go and get your Brian Barnett Memorial deck. Don't forget to go over there and click and order yours today, soon.
One more thing I wanted to be sure to mention before I leave.
Yeah.
Sure.
I wanted to explain how it is we know that the Gosford glyphs are legitimate.
Okay, good.
Go for it. Yeah, bring it.
Andy's like, dance.
Traditional Egyptian writing can be written to be read from left to right or from right to left or from top to bottom. And the way you know which way to read it is based on the direction that the figures, like the animal figures, are facing. You read towards their face. Okay.
Yes.
Now they're all supposed to sit facing the same direction in a legitimate Egyptian inscription. So when I first saw the Gosford glyphs, my impulse was these can't be legitimate because in one case there's a rectangle called a serach, and above that serach is a bird that's facing the wrong direction. And so I thought whoever did these glyphs didn't know what they were doing. They have to be not real. Then I did some research and discovered that in the very early days of Egyptian hieroglyphic language, that was sometimes done. It was legitimate to turn the bird around the wrong way on top of the serach.
Huh?
Mhm.
So anyone who was trying to fake those glyphs wouldn't have known that.
Oh,
It's
cool.
also true that there were symbols discovered in the Gosford glyphs that were not discovered at the time in traditional Egyptology until the discovery of a couple of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, where they discovered these new glyphs. So anybody who was trying to fake it back in the 50s or whenever it was discovered
Wouldn't
and
have
used it, would not have known those glyphs.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
Oh, wow. Laird, you just blew it open for Mandy.
Have you you come up with your own like not interpretation but meaning for hieroglyphs that you believe have been misinterpreted previously? Have you had a chance to possibly go over the Gosford glyphs with your interpretation? Because I'm very interested in that and different interpretations following these new discoveries of what these glyphs actually stand for.
Well, that's a tricky process. I tend to work with individual words rather than whole texts. The problem with whole texts is, I was saying that there are clusters of meanings that go with every word. And I was also saying that any written text was looked upon as a security breach waiting to happen.
Well, yeah.
So one of the ways they protected important writings was, rather than writing the word itself, they wrote a homonym for the word. If I wanted to talk about the ocean or sea, I might write the word sea out of my eyes rather than sea meaning ocean.
Mhm.
And so
Yes.
anyone reading it, translating it, would get the same kind of gobbledygook you read when you read Egyptian translated text. That doesn't seem like, why would anybody write this way? But when it was read out loud, a person listening to it would hear the right meaning.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That is so clicking with Jules.
So the inscription itself might be tricky to try to translate because we don't know whether someone was doing that.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
There is
Yeah,
one thing I
great.
did notice, you guys,
What's
and
that?
having not been there, I'm not sure. The one thing that I did notice, unlike a lot of these earlier civilizations that we've uncovered, I didn't see that their temples or their statues face the sun for sunrise or sundown. And I didn't notice that it was in their lore that they verbally talk about, what little bit I've heard, anything about sun worship. And you'll find that in most all of the other cultures, but the Dogon, they're fixated with Sirius.
No, actually, if we're talking about dynamics of energy, spinning energy is the core of the issue.
Spinning energy, okay.
Spinning energy is that circle with the dot in the middle of it, which is the sun glyph. The sun is an icon of materiality. Sirius is an icon of non-materiality. That's why the heliacal rising of Sirius is so important. It's the point where the two come together.
Mandy, the disc, the spinning
Yeah,
disc. The disc, Mandy, the gold disc.
That's what I was
Also, in
going to ask.
terms of the directionality, if the tilt of the axis of the Earth has changed, as I believe it has, you can't count on the directionality depending on how old the site is.
Mhm.
Aha,
That's true.
true.
Could I
Mandy,
ask
go ahead.
if what we are considering to be a representation of the sun, could it possibly be representing these gold discs in which we know all of these cultures had and used, including the Dogons, had their own golden disc? We find it on the Aboriginal flag. We assume it's the sun, but could it be a golden disc?
If you email me, so I have a way of emailing you back, I'll research Egyptian words for solstice and see what I can turn up in terms of the symbols they use to express that.
Certainly.
Thank you, Laird. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone in the chat room, all the moderators for doing a near impossible job tonight.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
so
you
much.
for being there for us and taking care of that. And we love all of you. And for those who need to work on energy, we right now wish you the very best. We send all of our love and healing intents to anyone with negative energy or energies that are bringing them down, that they go into the rest of this week with joy, peace, love in their hearts and minds. And we thank you very much for being here with us, and we love each and every one of you.
We do.
Thank you. Thank you, Laird. We'll be in touch.
Thanks so
you,
much.
Laird.
Good
Thank
night,
you,
everybody.
panelists. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.